So it's week 18 of the NFL regular season, and for most of you that probably means nothing at all. But if you're like me and you got worms in your brain, then this is a very exciting time because it means that the playoffs are almost here. We've got 16 games this weekend, some of which are meaningless, but many of which have grand ramifications for the rest of the playoff picture. It can be confusing to sort of navigate through all this, largely because the NFL is a lawless wasteland. Football is dumb. I love football, as you can see. Football's dumb. It doesn't make sense logically. It just doesn't. But I'm going to do my best to help us navigate and get us there. So just stick with me. Hopefully by the end you'll know a little bit more than you did before, or if you already knew all this, you can think of it as a refresher. So, there are 32 teams in the NFL. They're all right here on this beautiful bulletin board. But there are only 14 playoff spots. I'm going to start over here. I've got a bulletin board. You got AFC playoff seeds and NFC playoff seeds. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with football, these 32 teams are divided into two conferences. The AFC, which is on the top, and the NFC, which is on the bottom. The American Football Conference and the National Football Conference. Every Super Bowl is played between one AFC team and one NFC team. The playoffs are essentially whittling down each conference to one team, which represents the conference in the Super Bowl. The team that gets the number one seed gets to have the first week of playoffs off. They do not have to play a game, which is a huge advantage. Football is so aggressive, so physical. Having a week to rest and recuperate and plan is everything. But the other seeds are also important because they determine whether you get to play at home. And that is also a huge advantage. Because if you've ever watched a football game and noticed that it only gets loud about half the time, that's because the home fans are usually shouting, screaming, during the away team's, offensive drive to try to make it harder for them to communicate. And that when it comes to the playoffs, that can have huge, huge impact. There are 9 teams that have clinched the playoffs already. 4 in the AFC, 5 in the NFC. So I'm going to go ahead and move them over first and foremost. These are the teams who've already clinched the playoffs. I will run down the line. The Ravens clinched it a while ago. The Ravens are easily the team to beat right now. The Dolphins clinched it a little bit ago. They've also been very good, though they've struggled with injury, as they do often. The Chiefs started off hot, have really struggled down the line. Don't tell my hat I said that, but we sort of stumbled our way into winning the division because the rest of our division opponents suck. And the Browns managed to get there despite their starting quarterback being very beat up. They brought in backup Joe Flacco, who you may have heard before. In the NFC, the Niners locked up the 1 seed last week. They're also very good, though they've kind of fallen off the last few weeks. The Cowboys locked up the 2 seed a little while ago, though they may not keep it. The Lions have the 3 seed. They won the NFC North. They won their division for the first time since the early 90s. And for the first time since they've been in the NFC North, because they were in the NFC Central back in the 90s. And then the Eagles and Rams both have really solid win-loss records, so they clinch the playoffs as well. Now, you might be thinking, Cthulhu, why are the 1, 2, 3, and 5 seeds clinched in the AFC but not the 4 seed? And, that's a reasonable question. And the answer is, I say again, football's fucking dumb. The NFL is a lawless wasteland. Nothing makes sense. Okay? You might think, oh, the 7 teams with the best records go to the playoffs. No. No, that'd make too much sense. No, it has to be Byzantine. It has to make no sense. It has to have 5 parameters. So, the top 4 seeds are for the winners of each division. as you can see on here, I've got these split up. You got the AFC East, AFC North, AFC South, AFC West. Those are divisions. So when I was saying earlier that the Chiefs won their division, that only means they had better records than the Broncos, Raiders, and Chargers. And if you're in a division and you have a better record than the other three in the division, you're in the playoffs. That's all it takes. Now, if you happen to be in a division with a team like the Ravens, who are 13-3, it's going to be real hard to win the division. But you could still have a very good record like the Browns and make the playoffs because the 5, 6, and 7 seeds are for the non-division winners with the best overall record. So that's why the Eagles are in the same division as the Cowboys, but they both have very good records. So the Eagles still make it into the playoffs despite not winning the division. However, this leads to some weird scenarios. For example, sometimes the 7 seed has a better record than the 4 seed. Because winning your division does not mean you have a good record. It just means you won over the other 3 people in your division. I'm looking right here at the NFC South, because that happens every year. NFC South is where good football goes to die. We don't have time for that right now, though. Anyway, now let's take the teams that have been eliminated from the playoffs and turn them around. So, got a lot of teams that have been eliminated. The New York Jets have been eliminated from the playoffs. They got eliminated several weeks ago. The New England Patriots suck it. Got eliminated a while ago. The Bengals got eliminated last week after the Chiefs beat them. Sorry. The Tennessee Titans, were eliminated a while ago as well. They're not awful, but there's no way they're making it. They don't have the pieces. And every other team in the Chiefs division also got eliminated. Chargers, it was a good hot second ago, because the Chargers are terrible this year. Chargers are really bad. But the Raiders and Broncos, it took a while. The Broncos almost got there, in fact. They were looking like they were knocking on the door for a bit. But they just could not pull it together, alas. Sorry, Broncos fans. Not that sorry, though. And then, in the NFC, these two, in the NFC East, the Giants and the Commanders, have both been eliminated. Commanders was a while ago. The Giants, it was only just recently. They were also knocking on the door for a while, but they just couldn't. It wasn't going to happen. They started off in such a slump. It was going to be really hard to turn it around anyway. Bears just got eliminated despite being one of the worst teams in the NFC, because the NFC here. This is another weird thing about football. Okay, it's that one conference can be really, really good. And that means you have to be really good to make the playoffs. So, like, the Browns are the top wild card in the AFC. They're 11-5. The 7 seed in the AFC it has like a 9-7. The 7 seed in the NFC has 8-8. So a lot more teams could potentially sneak in there. The NFC is a lot more top heavy. There's a lot of great teams at the top, and then a bunch of bottom feeders. Speaking of the bottom feeders, the NFC South. Carolina Panthers are the worst team in the NFL this year. Thanks, David Tepper. You're a real charmer. David Tepper is the owner of the Carolina Panthers. And he just got fined $300K for throwing a drink on a Jaguars fan, which is about 0.00014% of his net worth. Someone compared it, if you asked a millionaire to write a $14 check, it'd equate to about that. And then the Cardinals, alas, also been eliminated. They tried, damn it, they tried. So that means these are the people still in contention for playoff spots. In the AFC, you've got 4 playoff spots and 5 teams. Things are real dicey in the AFC. Things are very interesting. And you'll notice that 3 of those teams are right in the AFC South. But we'll get to that. The NFC, you've got 6 teams fighting over 2 spots. Because again, the NFC has a lot more bottom feeders, which means there's a lot more room to sneak in there. So let's go down the line. Let's go by division, and we will discuss each team's scenario to get into the playoffs. The Bills. So the Bills are in a weird spot. Because if they see, these numbers are not firm. This just means they're in the playoffs, and I put their current seed there. The Dolphins do not have the number 2 seed locked up. They don't have the division locked up. If they lose to the Buffalo Bills on Sunday night, the Bills win the division. But if they beat the Bills miss the playoffs, potentially. There are still a few scenarios where they could make it. Primarily, if they win the division. That's it. Win and they're in. If they tie, they're in. If Pittsburgh loses or ties, if the Steelers lose or tie, they're in. If the Jaguars lose or tie, they're in. Or if Houston and Indianapolis tie, they're in. So if they would very much like to avoid all those weird scenarios and just win it. But in all fairness, their game is the last game of the season. So they may or may not play as hard because, well, if they find out the Steelers lost or the Jaguars lost, they know they've made the playoffs anyway. The main thing they'll be playing for at that point is home field advantage in the playoffs. The Bills have several scenarios they could make the playoffs, but they still have a very solid chance of missing them altogether. Win, and they're the 2 seed in the AFC. Lose, and they could miss the playoffs altogether. It's bananas. This is what I love and hate about the NFL. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. The Pittsburgh Steelers are a team that nobody thought was going to make noise at the middle of the season. At the beginning, maybe. In the middle, no. They're 9-7 right now. They could still very well make the playoffs. But it would take some doing. They have 5 scenarios they can make it. If they win and the Bills lose, they're in the playoffs. If they win and Jacksonville loses or ties, they're in the playoffs. If they win and these 2 teams tie, they're in the playoffs. If they tie and the Jags lose and these 2 don't tie, they're in. Or if the Jags lose and the Broncos, who are not eligible to make the playoffs anymore, win, and one of these 2 teams wins, they're in the playoffs. I hope you've been keeping track. It's weird. Now, the really interesting part of the AFC, the part that I will be paying rapt attention to, is the AFC South. The Jaguars currently have this 4 seed, but these 3 teams are tied. The only thing keeping the Jaguars ahead is that they have the head-to-head tiebreaker against them. I'm not exactly sure. Tiebreakers usually involve if you've beaten them in the season, how many games you've won within that division, how many games you've won in the conference, point differential, and eventually coin flip, which is very funny. I want to see it someday. I want to see a playoff spot depend on a coin flip. It'd be very funny, just to make the NFL look more farcical than it already does. The Jaguars, if they win against the Titans, they're in the playoffs. That's it. Easy. If they tie, and these 2 teams tie, they're in the playoffs. They win the division. But they can also clinch the playoffs if they tie and the Steelers lose or tie, or they can make the playoffs if Pittsburgh loses and the Broncos lose and one of these teams wins. But if they lose and one of these 2 teams wins, they might miss the playoffs. In fact, they're very likely to miss the playoffs. Similar to the Bills situation, where it's like, win and you get bountiful riches, lose and you're gone. It's weird. The Jaguars have been on a skid this season. They're not playing their best football these last few weeks, which makes me nervous for this last game of the season, because it means beating the Titans is not guaranteed, especially playing their backup quarterback, C.J. Beathard, or Beathard if you're nasty. Either of these two teams could easily sneak in and take the division. Speaking of these two teams, the Indianapolis Colts and the Houston Texans. If Houston, from my understanding, Indianapolis currently is ahead of the Texans because they have the tiebreaker. But if Houston beats Indianapolis, they clinch the division. It doesn't matter what Jacksonville does. But if they... Oh, this is confusing. So they clinch the AFC South with a win, or if Jacksonville loses or ties. So even if Indianapolis wins, they don't necessarily clinch the South. Texans can still make the playoffs. If they just win and Jacksonville wins, they at least make the playoffs, at worst. If they tie and Jacksonville loses and the Steelers lose or tie, they also make the playoffs. But they are just outside. They are right now the 8 seed. So they are one outside of the playoffs right now. So they got to win, essentially, or get incredibly lucky. The Colts, to win the division, would need to win and have Jacksonville lose or tie, or they would need to tie with the Texans, and the Jags would need to lose outright. So the AFC South is the division to watch this weekend. It's bizarre. It's bananas. Now, the NFC. The NFC is, it's weird. You'll notice, similar to the AFC South, that there's 3 teams remaining in this division, but we'll get there. You might think, oh, it's because they're all very good. We'll get there. The NFC North, the Packers currently, the Green Bay Packers, are the 7 seed. All they need to do is beat the Chicago Bears on Sunday, and they make the playoffs. They're the 7 seed, right below the Rams. If they lose, well, that's not ideal. Packers have, in fact, 6. If you thought the 5 scenarios for the Steelers weren't enough, the Packers have 6 scenarios to make the playoffs. If they win, they're in the playoffs. If they tie and Seattle loses, or tie plus New Orleans loses or ties, the Saints, New Orleans Saints, they're in the playoffs. Or if Green Bay ties and Seattle loses, Seattle Seahawks, and Tampa Bay loses, they're in the playoffs. Or if they tie plus Seattle ties plus Tampa Bay loses or ties, they're in the playoffs. Or the Vikings lose or tie, and Seattle lose or tie, and Tampa Bay lose. No, sorry, Seattle lose, not tie. Or the Vikings lose or tie, and the Seahawks lose, and the Saints lose. They make the playoffs. Speaking of the Vikings, they have 2 scenarios. So the Packers are just have a lot more breathing room. Even if they tie, they still have a solid chance of making the playoffs. But they'd rather not go there. They'd rather just win and be done with it. The Vikings, Minnesota Vikings, make the playoffs. If they win, and the Packers lose, and the Seahawks lose, and the Bucks lose, or the Vikings win, and Green Bay loses, and Seattle loses, and the Saints lose. So basically, they need the Packers and Seahawks to lose, and one of these 2 teams to lose. Sorry, Vikings fans. I'm not so confident in your chances. I'd love to be wrong. I love the Vikings. You guys are a great team. I'm not holding my breath. The NFC West. We're going to skip you for now. Bad. The Seattle Seahawks are currently, they're the 8. So just like the Texans in the AFC, the Seahawks are the 8 in the NFC. The Seahawks, all they would need, since they are right under the Packers right now, is to win and the Packers to lose or tie. That's it. or if they tie and the Packers lose and Tampa Bay loses or ties, or if Seattle ties and Green Bay loses and New Orleans loses or ties. So a lot of people are actually hinging on these fellas for some reason. It's very strange. Speaking of these fellas, welcome to Hell Division. This is the NFC South. The Buccaneers. Okay, so the 49ers are the 1 seed. They have a 12-4 record. Great. The Cowboys are the 2 seed. They have an 11-5 record. Great. The Lions are the 3 seed. They have an 11-5 record. Awesome. Makes sense. The Eagles are the 5 seed. They have an 11-5 record. The Rams are the 6 seed. They have a 9-7 record. The Bucks are the 4 seed. They have an 8-8 record. The Falcons have a 7-9 record. The Saints have an 8-8 record. If the Bucks win, they're in the playoffs. If the Bucks tie and the Saints lose or tie, they win the division. They can still make the playoffs if they tie and the Seahawks lose and the Packers lose or tie. The Saints can win the division if they win and the Bucks lose or tie, or if they tie and the Bucks lose. They can still make the playoffs if they win and Seattle loses or ties and Green Bay loses or ties, or if they tie and Seattle lost and Green Bay lost. The fucking Atlanta Falcons can make the playoffs if they win and the Bucks lose. The Falcons would have an 8-9 record. They would have a losing record for the season and get higher playoff seeding than the Eagles and the Rams. They would get higher playoff seeding, mind you, than a team with an 11-5 record. Because the NFL doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. It's nothing. Nothing makes sense. And that's half the fun. But it also drives a person crazy. Making playoffs by division, while a neat idea in concept, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense now. Especially when the football, baseball and basketball, you play dozens of games in a season. You have a pretty good idea of who the best teams are. Fucking football? You play 17 games, that's it. There's no logic. There's no rhyme or reason to any of it. It's so nothing. It's so nonsensical. The fucking Atlanta Falcons could make the playoffs with an 8-9 record. They could make the playoffs, and the Bills could miss them. The Bills, mind you, could lose and still have a 10-7 record and miss the playoffs in favor of the Atlanta Falcons, who have an 8-9 record. Yeah, fucking America's game. I don't know. That's the thing about this year, okay? I don't want to seem like a downer. Anybody could make the Super Bowl. Honest to God. Can you imagine? We start this off thinking, oh, the Ravens and the Niners are the teams to beat, and we get a fucking Steelers-Falcons Super Bowl somehow. It's possible. It's mathematically possible. There's no... I don't have anything else to say. Nothing that could actually add anything to the conversation. I love football. I hate football. Happy New Year. Happy birthday.